Okay, well, I think we're going to start this right on time. Thank you all for joining. I'm Susan. We've got Laura McMillan on the line, who's really going to explain what's happening in the the world of entry-level driver training and the changes that will be coming up. As well, we will then, and I will be sending those of you the press release within the next couple minutes here, so you can understand just how ITI is going to be helping navigate these changes that will be happening by February 2020. So at this point, you are all muted. If you have any questions, please just type them in, and Laura will answer those as we go. So Laura, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this session where we review a quick review of the entry-level driver training. And as Susan said, outline the solutions that we prepared at Instructional Technologies to help prepare the market for a sea change involving entry-level driver training. As Susan noted, I did participate with the Entry-Level Driver Acting Committee. This committee was formed back in 2013, late 2013, so we're going back several years, but not nearly as long as the industry has been waiting for some guidance as far as a quality entry-level driver training program and to prepare drivers for a CDL. The industry has been waiting over 28 years for a curriculum for professional drivers, if you can believe that. And for many years, prior to my role at ITI, I had operated a large driver training academy for a major carrier, and we had determined to use our own standards for driver training, and many of the leading edge companies, carriers, and private fleets have done that independent of the federal government, and in some cases the states. But now, coming in 2020, we will have a set of definite standards for the professional driver and the training of professional drivers in the acquisition of their commercial driver's licenses, and along with that, a robust curriculum and instructor standards and training center standards that will apply. So we want to briefly cover that to make people aware of what the changes are and what the new rules will be as part of that regulatory script. And basically, to not get into too much of the weeds of exactly what all of these entail, at the end of this presentation, we'll point you to a link where you can read up on the DOT, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's guidelines for the new ruling. But here we're going to highlight some of the big changes so that you're aware of that, and again, help you understand some of the solutions that we put together to help enable the market to get ready. Okay, so new rules for CDL schools, and the implementation date for the new ruling is, for entry-level driver training, is February 7th, 2020. So that's less than a year away. The committee that pulled the curriculum guidelines and standards together, we had provided the recommendation, and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration approved the recommendations for the change for the federal minimum standards, and that was back in late 2015, and there was a 3-year suspense period, and so we're coming up on it in 2020. So again, a big sea change, and we'll be going through the big pieces of this. But at a high level, what this regulation from FMICSA includes is setting minimum standards for CDL schools. Now, when we say CDL schools, we mean, again, the public commercial driver license schools, oftentimes the technical schools, community colleges are in that grouping. We also have the private CDL schools that process a lot of students that are obtaining their CDL. But also what's included and where this law applies, and I'd like to make a point of this because there is some misunderstanding in the market and with our client base, is that any entity that is training a driver, a new entrant driver for a CDL, these new rules will apply to them. So, for example, a private fleet, these rules will apply. So, for example, what is popular and growing with many private fleets as a way to source their own drivers is to implement dock-to-driver type programs where they take logistic technicians or dock workers and then run them through a CDL type training program, oftentimes on site as the capacity is able at a private fleet or one of their terminals. And so even though that's held at a private carrier and they're not sending students off campus to a CDL school, these new rules do apply to a private fleet that is preparing people to take the CDL test to obtain their CDL. The same is true for the for-hire carriers, the large carriers or mid-sized carriers that have their own CDL schools in-house. Again, even though they're not sourcing necessarily from a CDL or sending students to a school to obtain that, and they're managing that all on site, the law still applies to them. They will still need to comply with the federal minimum standards. These are the Department of Transportation standards, and the agency is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Schools are required to register and self-certify, and you'll be seeing language around something called the Training Provider Registry. Now, this is a bit of the clearinghouse that the DOT is setting up for schools or again, entities that are providing CDL training. Can you back up a second there? Who are providing CDL training to actually self-register. So much of what we have in many cases within the industry is a self-regulatory type market where, depending on the DOT rule, for example, the medical registry carriers self-register through that system. So medical providers also register through the medical certification registry. Well, this is very similar. In fact, the training provider registry is modeled on the medical provider registry. There will be requirements for the teachers or instructors that are working directly with students, whether it's in a classroom, at truck, or behind the wheel capacity. And the big increase that people will feel, the entities providing training and certainly the people going through the training, is that there will be an increase in the curriculum standards. So we are moving from today's environment of only 4 topics that are required by the feds to obtain a CDL to 31 topics. So that's a big change, and we'll talk kind of, again, roughly about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, there will be a self-certification, self-registration process as this begins to roll out. The current rules, CDL training and testing standards, are largely determined by the states. Now, there's a lot of commonality because the CDL testing guidelines for both the permit and the skills testing is profiled and recommended by the American Association for Motor Vehicle Administrators, or AMVA for short. And so many states follow the AMVA guidelines. And in some cases for CDL training, states take a more than the federal level, more than the state level for AMVA approach with CDL training, and many states do not. So it's kind of different from state to state. And any organization that meets state requirements can be a training provider. So again, on a state-by-state basis, if they meet those requirements, great. If they don't, then they don't provide training in that state. But if it's a carrier that operates in multiple terminals or multi-state environment, they may offer training, CDL training, in a different location that basically short circuits around a state-based requirement. In the new environment with entry-level driver training, there will be a new federal minimum standard for all CDL schools and entities providing training. And as I mentioned, it establishes a new training provider registry that schools must apply to join that registry. And that registry becomes a clearinghouse between the student taking training through a qualified school, and that registry is then data around the student completion of training requirements is then accessed by the state agencies before granting or even scheduling a CDL skills test. Next slide, please. I guess one last point on this, the training provider registry, I'd like to say there's a lot of language in the ruling about the training provider registry. This is, again, modeled on the medical provider registry, and as such, there's some technical issues with it, an IT system that needs to be stood up, and it's not yet live. We do know quite a bit about what is required for the registry for training providers to provide through the TPR, but we don't have that system live to actually demo it for folks just yet. Okay, next slide. All right, so training standards that are established. So the current rules. As I mentioned, the training standards can vary widely from state to state and from public to private CDL schools. There's quite a spectrum of CDL training, and as such, quite a spectrum of different qualities of schools. On one end, you have what we refer to as CDL mills, where the minimum training is completed, and then basically maybe a weekend course, and someone can practice with a vehicle and then take their CDL test in literally a weekend or less. And then you have the publicly funded schools with Title IV funding that have 270-hour minimum programs. So there's again, has not been a federal guideline. It's really across the board as far as what schools offer and state to state. From a federal requirements, there are only 4 knowledge topics currently required at the federal level, and that would be hours of service, driver qualifications and disqualifications, driver health and wellness, and whistleblower protection. If everyone on the call was interested in at least recovering the knowledge requirements, we could, in theory, cover that within a couple of hours to give you an idea of how minimal that requirement is. And yet, that is those minimum requirements are currently what is used to train and test people to obtain their CDL. What had been recognized in the market and also with public pressure is that just simply wasn't enough for a professional driver in terms of what they need to know to operate safely, legally on America's roadways. So with the new regulations in mind, in the spirit of preparing drivers for a professional career, there's now a standardized 31 theory course library of knowledge topics that are required, and then 19 behind the wheel skills. That includes on the range, 7 on the range backing maneuvers that are required for testing, and then 12 on the road behind the wheel skills tests. And those tests are all proficiency based. The 31 theory courses require an 80% or better pass rate from a student. So they can't just simply take a few of these and ace them and then fail all the rest. They have to average in all 31 theory courses. They need to have an 80% or better pass rate, and they need to achieve and demonstrate proficiency in all 19 behind the wheel and hands-on skills required. CDL schools and entities must record and report hours spent behind the wheel, but there's no federal minimum. So when the law was proposed regulations were moving through the system for approval, that we did originally, from a committee basis, we did propose minimum hours, but those were pulled in the 11th hour prior to the, FMIX's approval of the regulations. So there's a proficiency requirement, but right now there is no hands-on time behind the wheel minimum hours requirement. However, on the training provider registry, the government wants each training entity to record how many hours on a per student basis they completed in their CDL training program. And part of that is really a data capture effort exercise. So it's not mandatory as far as a minimum, but the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration wants to start to collect data on the average number of hours that students spend in CDL training. And then behind the wheel, range and road, and vehicle inspection skills are still tested at the state DMV. So that is not being tested at a federal level, but it will still be managed at the state DMV agency level. Next slide, please. Requirements for instruction. So just like CDL training curriculum, the instructor qualifications vary from state to state, and you have everything along the spectrum again. For your CDL mills, you may have someone that's got, Joe Trucking, that somebody with experience, but not necessarily experienced training, taking somebody out in a truck and getting them just basically minimally familiarized with equipment so they can then take their CDL test on a Monday. So you have everything from some people with no actual instructor background or have been vetted as an instructor to technical schools that often do vet instructors at a more formal level. With the new ELDT rules, there are mandates for minimum qualifications for instructors for the classroom, on the road, and on a range course, as well as on the road behind the wheel instruction. The minimum qualifications, there's a time basis to this minimum. It's 2 years of actual driving in the equipment that the student is being tested for. So they have, as well as they need to have a clean MVR, motor vehicle record, and a clean med cert card. So they essentially need to be an active CDL holding driver with actual driving experience, a minimum of 2 years, and ideally from a school perspective have some training in instructor training qualifications. We'll get to that in a moment when we talk about our solution. Schools will, through the training provider registry, self-certify their instructors. The individual instructors and trainers do not have to register with the DOT on their own. In a way, they're sponsored really through the schools and the entities that they're providing CDL training through. So when the school self-certifies, they list all of their instructors and their instructor qualifications in the training provider registry. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about what's coming as far as the change in the rules. And before I move on to our launch of OnRamp, which is a comprehensive solution to help prepare the market for this sea change of entry-level driver training requirements, are there any questions that we have from folks? No? Okay. Well, let's move on. We'll talk about our comprehensive solution that involves online training, testing, and training provider registry connectivity. Okay, so our solution, we're featuring OnRamp, which again is a comprehensive solution to help CDL schools and carrier entities that are providing CDL training, help prepare them and successfully manage CDL training. And so there's 4 components and key features to OnRamp. So we have comprehensive training and testing. So OnRamp, the ITI OnRamp solution meets all of the entry-level driver training theory and testing requirements on all 31 core curriculum areas that are required for testing. Moreover, our testing, in particular with the knowledge topics, is a mastery test pass rate. So 100% is required for mastery proficiency or demonstration of proficiency in our lessons. Recall that what I just mentioned with the required testing requirements on the knowledge topics, that the federal government is requiring a minimum of 80% pass rate, while our content is preparing the student to pass at 100% and actually test them at the 100% level. Additionally, there's 24/7 access to training. So students can access training on a computer, tablet, or mobile device. Wherever they have access to a web browser, they can access the ELDT curriculum. This is beneficial to organizations that want to help prepare students before they come to CDL training, because students certainly can start taking those topics before they attend CDL training, within the training environment, and certainly they have these lessons to go back to refresh their memory after they complete training. They can go back to these lessons, especially in today's environment too, where students are waiting sometimes 60 to 90 days before they get a scheduled date to take their CDL road test at the state DMV office. It's important that they stay on top of the content information to prepare for their skills test and be comfortable and prepared for that test. So they have access to this training long after the actual CDL training environment, they have access to it. It includes Centix ELDT, which is our custom-built learning management system that's designed specifically for the CDL training school environment. So we use this CDL-based learning management system to help manage the student workflow from prior to training, through the training experience, through all of the testing requirements for CDL students, all the way through their CDL test. So you can manage, a school administrator can manage all aspects of the training environment, from the online to the range course requirements to the group training requirements, if that applies, to all of the testing requirements for students, including range course time and behind the wheel time. That data then is connected or integrated into the training provider registry to make a very seamless data capture for or on behalf of the school administrator. So instead of keeping 2 or 3 different systems to track students on, which is often the case for CDL schools, they're operating with different systems to try to and sort of cobble together, data on each student. Now they're able to use one platform to seamlessly track and manage their students through their entire CDL training process and have a seamless integration with the training provider registry once that's available. Lastly, we feature group training modules where instructors can use the group training mode to look at real-world situations, work through different scenarios with students, answer student questions live, at the same time use the benefit of online training to guide that group session. So when I say benefit of online training is you have a consistent message within the training. And again, all of our content meets all of the very specific learning objectives and requirements of the ELDT curriculum. So the instructors have the ease of use of using an online module to track and make sure that they cover all of the different key learning objectives in each of the 31 topic areas. But at the same time, they have the flexibility to manage group discussions and have, bring a rich training environment to the trainees that are there for their CDL. Next slide, please. So a little bit more in depth with the Centix entry-level driver training LMS. It is a custom-built solution to meet the needs of schools and entities and make it easier for them to meet the requirements of the ELDT mandate. So again, just in summary, it's a platform to collect information of all registered students, including all of the data required by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration vis-a-vis the training provider registry. It allows for the deployment of all of the online training, as well as all of the required assessments in both an individual and a group setting. For the group setting, we do have the group training module that allows the instructors the flexibility to manage a delivery of training as a group. The Centix ELDT also provides the ability to log all of the behind the wheel hours from the individual driver trainees as required, again, by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It'll automatically send student completion data, including proficiency scores, to the training provider registry, which again, when that's stood up and functioning, then that data is relayed to the state agencies so that they're aware that the student has attended a qualified school and that they've completed all the requirements. Next slide, please. The group training module makes presenting and recording the student attendance and participation quicker and easier. So for an instructor, they can show, for example, an on-ramp video in a classroom. Students will automatically get an accompanying quiz with that, with the deployment of that video. They still have to score 80% or higher to demonstrate proficiency in a group setting. So they're not, there's no bending of the rule here. We're making this as easy as possible from a delivery perspective for the instructor to complete all of the content, have the flexibility of delivery options, and still use a platform to keep and maintain an alignment with the standards, including the testing standards for each individual person. The Centix ELDT records the assessments and the completion of quizzes, regardless of whether students took the course individually or in a group setting. Next slide, please. So a little bit with ITI, we're not new to this group. I mean, certainly our company is not new. For many of you, you know something about us. We've been in business over 20 years, and for much of that history, 17 years has been providing content to Roadmaster, the largest CDL school in North America, as well as other CDL schools, publicly funded, privately funded CDL schools, and certainly we have a history with carriers that offer their own CDL training. We do expect with this sea change that we will have certainly the players in the CDL school market will rise to the top that are looking out ahead of these regulations and getting prepared to adopt them and engage students in a new curriculum. And we expect to be right there backing them up with our programming to make that transition as easy as possible. We are an active member of the Commercial Vehicle Training Alliance, which is the industry's leading association that is all things commercial vehicle training, and is a great resource for certainly learning more about the impacts of entry-level driver training. And they're certainly tracking on that issue. They've been very actively involved with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, as we have as well, to help formulate the curriculum, and they will certainly be there to help all association members with this transition. Just some numbers so that people understand the scope of what we've offered over the years. We have delivered, as far as CDL online training, we've offered 2.6 million lessons. We've had over 109,000 individual students and 6,008 courses per month on average completed. So we've worked through the numbers, we've worked through the hiccups pretty early on, and so we know how to support a large audience of CDL students. And I think given that we've been tied to the hip with Roadmaster, the largest private CDL trainer in the country, it's fair to say we have effectively trained many of the nation's CDL holders all along. So we are very, very well positioned and have really taken our vast knowledge of the requirements for entry-level driver training and have updated them and made them even made our systems even more durable and reliable and proficient, and of course relevant in terms of bringing the content up to the current code. So we stand ready to support schools and entities providing CDL training at any level. And do we have another slide after this, Tom? Okay, so additional ELDT resources I mentioned up front. We were not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the law itself, but we welcome you to take a look at some excellent resources. The FAQs from the Department of Transportation is a good current knock list of the major questions surrounding ELDT, and that's updated pretty regularly as any modifications are made and updates are provided. So that's a great link and resource. Check that out if you'd like the latest information or to read in more detail the law itself. And then we have our own blog posts where we are active in providing education to the community as well. So please check out what we have in blog form. And we also have, I believe, tied to this webinar, some printed collateral, some sheets, PDFs you can download that again give you a nice one-page summary of ELDT and what's coming, and most importantly, how ITI can help. So with that, those are my remarks, and we'd like to open it up to any questions that people have.
Yeah, we've got a couple here that were typed out, and then we'll unmute everyone if there's some other questions. But one of our questions here, Laura, is what is your sense of how the rule will increase competition in the market for CDL training? Will it lead to more CDL training providers or fewer?
That's a great question. There's a lot of speculation as to what impact there will be. When there was a cost-benefit study done of the proposed rule, it was believed that the industry could absorb the changes, but that it would put pressure on the driver shortage issue, that there will simply be entities that currently provide CDL training that will be unwilling to do training or cannot do or meet the new requirements, and they will fall away, if you will, as a resource to train. So that will put certainly pressure on the driver shortage, which everyone knows about. At the same time, it provides an opportunity for those entities and schools that are ready and prepared to expand their operation, to to be an even more dedicated provider, if you will, to the industry or to high volume carriers or high demand carriers. So it does provide opportunities for the entities that are ready, including beyond schools, including carriers that do adopt in-house training. It is expected that many carriers, either private fleets or for-hire carriers, will be re-energizing in-house CDL training programs or starting up a CDL training program. Part of that is not necessarily just a reaction to the new set of regulations, but rather it's more driven by the demand, the driver shortage issue, and a demand to sort of control their own pipeline of drivers. And there's some evidence and data from the largest carriers that have provided data or shared it in the market via benchmarking, that homegrown drivers, those that carriers train and maintain or build on their, from their own ranks, either a doctor-driver program or bring someone in-house and take them through the CDL training and grow your own sort of effort, that those drivers tend to be safer than the average CDL student, at least from a 0 to 90-day basis. So whether it's dealing with driver shortage, growing your own for the productivity factor, but as well as the safety factor, that's where the trends are expected to go. But we'll see. we'll see how it all plays out when this goes live.
And then one other question, and then again we'll unmute it. What's the biggest challenge you see for CDL schools? Is it the taking over of the DMV roles? What are you seeing as the biggest challenge?
I think I think there's a few challenges, but first of all, mentioned the driver shortage, which everyone is well aware. That's a pain point all over the place. I don't know anyone who's swimming in drivers. So, but just as there's a shortage of drivers, there's an even greater shortage of qualified personnel to train them. So that's a pain point for schools that they don't realize it maybe now, because there are no standards in most cases, or minimal standards at a state level for an instructor resource, but they will certainly feel it when the switch is flipped to the new law, and where there's very concrete qualifications for instructors. So I think that will be a pain point, just the personnel factor. But I also think the integration with training provider registry and complying with the federal standard, not just having the curriculum in place, which is definitely a challenge as well, but to have that integrated with a training provider registry, I think that's going to be a significant challenge for many schools in operation today.
Okay, so that's it for our written questions. Tom, you want to unmute real quick and see if we've got any verbal questions from anyone?
Oh, yeah, this is Aaron Huff with CCJ. I have a quick question. How long has this rule been out so people can read it and get all the information, or did the fact that you were on the committee, Lauren, did that give you an advanced kind of start on designing courses that meet the regulations?
Great question, Aaron. I did serve on the working committee for the curriculum and the hazmat requirements, so I did have some advanced knowledge that we've been operating in the entry-level driver training market actually for some time, as I mentioned. But we did have special insight into the requirements of the curriculum and for the technology requirements. So we had some insight into that. But as far as the go live on the final ruling, that was in late 2016.
Is there any way that you
or 2016.
Hang on a minute here. I'm in the middle of a webinar here.
Hopefully I answered your question there. You heard me, Aaron.
Yes, you did. Thanks.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? All right, well, by now you should have received, I've sent the press release to those of you that have attended. Others will get it much later today. I also sent you a couple of images as well as these slides. So feel free, if you have any more questions, you can contact me or Laura. But thank you for attending, and I guess that's it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.